Hello and welcome to Interpreting India. I'm Srinath Raghavan, and this is a podcast presented by Carnegie India. Every week, we bring to you voices from India and around the world as we unpack the role of technology, the economy, and foreign policy in shaping India's relationship with the world. In the wake of the recent coronavirus outbreak, we are now recording and producing episodes of Interpreting India remotely. So please bear with us if there are any issues with sound quality. The coronavirus pandemic has brought home to us the importance of the state and its capacity on multiple fronts. The crisis has underlined, as few events have in recent decades, the state's Hobbesian function of providing security and keeping social unrest in check. Policing has acquired a peculiar salience in this context, quite different from its traditional role. In India, while the importance of effective policing is acknowledged in principle, in practice, we are far short of having a capable, effective, and accountable police force for a country of our size and diversity. Again, while the need for police reforms is widely recognized, a range of political, institutional, and bureaucratic hurdles have stymied these attempts over decades. A recent study, the first of its kind, called India Justice Report, assesses the state capacity of India's police force and identifies key areas where reforms are most urgently needed. The report also focuses on three other pillars of justice provision in India: the judiciary, prisons, and legal aid. In this episode of Interpreting India, I am joined by Maja Daruwala, who's currently Senior Advisor at Tata Trusts and the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative. Previously, she served as the Director of the Commonwealth Human Rights Initiative for 20 years, until she stepped down in September 2016. A barrister by training, Maja is actively engaged in numerous human rights initiatives and focuses on issues relating to civil liberties, including police reform, prison reform, right to information, legal empowerment, women's rights, freedom of expression, and human rights advocacy capacity building. Maja has steered the India Justice Report as its chief editor and a member of the steering committee itself. She's a recipient of the Nani Palkhiwala Award for Protection and Preservation of Civil Liberties in India. Maja, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much.
Maja, could we start by getting from you an overview, really, of the India Justice Report? I mean, this is such an important and in some ways the first exercise of its kind. So I'm keen to understand what were the motivations behind this study. And if you could also talk a little bit broadly about what you think are the headline conclusions which came out of the report itself.
You know, a lot of people work on specializations and they work on silos in even the ministries and even departments, civil society. They work on one subsection of the whole delivery of justice. So we wanted to bring all of the statistics, etc., that were available and put them together in a way that would be simple for both practitioners, duty holders, media, civil society, and most importantly, of government to have a look at and see, well, this is what the statistics tell us. We were determined not to put any judgments into the report. We just wanted to put the statistics together and the statistics to show what is their capacity to deliver. People imagine that if you go to a court and the court doesn't reply to you or takes too long, that it's kind of some kind of motivation or corruption. And some of that may be true. But really, we wanted to look at a deep dive into the various problems of structure and see whether they were real. And indeed, they were real. One of the broad findings was that, in my view, and I think if you look at the statistics, the finances that are expended on various subsystems of the justice system are low. For instance, in the judiciary, you find that increases in spending or increases in allocation don't keep up with the overall budgets. Across the country, the spend on the judiciary is perhaps lower than 1% or just about near 1%. On the other hand, in another subsystem, which is the police, the spend can go between 3 and 5%. Then infrastructure is a real problem in the sense that you don't have enough courts. And because you don't have enough judges, you don't notice that you don't have enough courts. But if you had all the judges that you should have, then you probably have a shortfall of something like 4,000 court orders. So workload means increased, huge workloads. Therefore, you can explain how there are over 30 million cases hanging fire, or that 25% of all cases take over 5 years to resolve. Diversity was another problem. And when you come to the police in that case, the country has promised itself that in its police and in various government organizations, that the desired percentage of women will be about 30-35%. But there are hardly any states, just 3 or 4 states, where the percentage is over even 10%. Some go to 18%, but they are all committed to between 30-35%. A last finding which I did want to talk about, Srinath, was that the urban and rural divide that we see in many other areas of governance is also reflected in judicial services being provided to the rural. Much fewer facilities available in the rural areas than in urban concentrations.
The report looks at, a set of things, right? You look at police, you look at judiciary, you look at prison reform, you look at, access to justice and so on. But perhaps in today's conversation, we'd like to focus a bit more in depth on the policing side of things itself. And it just seems to me that, in the first place, India seems to have fewer number of policemen per capita than many other countries, particularly Western countries, but also countries which are at a similar level of economic development as ours, right? So one of the main things that you focus in the report is, of course, on how various states are doing in terms of just getting personnel and so on. But the second point, which you mentioned, which I think is actually one of the very striking things about the report, is, the importance really of having a police force, which in some ways at least captures the diversity of this society around us, right? I mean, it's very difficult to have a police force which effectively works so closely with the community, but which does not at all have the kind of broader diversities which the community has. So you already spoke about women and how many states are unable to do. But the report also, quite rightly points out that, religious minorities, Muslims particularly, are quite underrepresented. We don't have that many transgender kind of representation within the police. So could you just talk a little bit both about overall numbers in terms of, policing itself, but also this question of diversity a little more?
Yeah, some of the, we could not get a hang of all of the diversities that you are talking about. Because the statistics are not there for them, but the statistics for women are indeed there for them. So we could talk about that to begin with, and it would amuse you, though the benchmark is to reach 33% of women in police. At the rate at which they are being recruited, you will find that states like Madhya Pradesh will take 294 years to get to that. Can you imagine that? And Maharashtra will take 14 years if it continues to recruit like that. So there are suggestions that have been made long ago about how to get more diversity into police, especially where in terms of women, there has been a lot of attention. One of the things is when you're recruiting, instead of recruiting only 33% of whatever is needed for that year or 2 years, you recruit fully so that you increase the number suddenly. But then there is no back-end infrastructure to accommodate that kind of thing. Everything has a knock-on effect. The other diversities are ST-SC, where there are ST-SC requirements. The SC recruitment, most of the states do manage to fill these vacancies at the constabulary level. But when you get to the officer level, then there is not that much data. And when you get minorities, in terms of religious minorities, they used to be in the data that was produced by government agencies like the BPR&D. But I noticed that for some time now, they have not been there. I think it's very important to have diversity in policing as well as in everything else. But in policing, since we are talking about that, I think it's really, really important because they are policing a public that in itself is diverse in caste, class, religion, economics, where they stay. And if this is reflected in the police, you're going to have a much more empathetic police. This has been shown in places like the US, the UK, which have battled with bias within the police for a long time.
Now, in the context of policing itself, one of the, to me, puzzling questions really is about, why is it that we have not managed to evolve a policing culture which in some ways comports with the kind of huge liberal democracy that we are, right? In a sense, our policing culture seems to be rather more heavily sort of influenced by the colonial origins of Indian policing rather than keeping with the norms and standards that you would expect in a 21st century liberal democracy. And there are many ways in which this is true in terms of how the police kind of conducts operations. There are various issues around sensitization about human rights, their protection violation, and of course at the very end of this extreme, there are gross abuses of which the Indian police is periodically sort of accused. So, what in your reading really is holding this kind of a cultural transformation of the police force beyond issues of nuts and bolts in terms of bringing in diversity, etc., is concerned? Because even if you do bring in diversity, but if the police has an organizational culture which is really out of kilter with what we need for a democracy like ours, then that is a big problem.
Yes, and I think that both the government as well as the police establishment have to recognize that they are out of kilter with whatever the aspirations of a liberal democracy are. And I think that there's still huge denial of that. So one issue, the reason for the way that the police function today is its structure. It is extremely hierarchical. The police will immediately tell you that it's based on colonial policing without going to the second sentence with if it is based on colonial policing, which was a control and command structure, which was policing meant for the regime in power at the time, then why has no opportunity been taken to change it? So one issue is the structure. The second issue, and I think a very equally important, is the structure suits certain interests, certain powers, certain authority, and therefore there is a sort of vested companionship between police, political, executive, bureaucracy, etc. And it would appear that sometimes I think that the last consideration is the people who the police are supposed to serve. The police still calls itself, or is generally called, a police force. Now, in a democracy, the first thing you do is change it to a police service and really work to fulfill that notion of service. In the olden days, it was you had to prevent crime, you had to investigate crime and catch criminals and then give them over to the judiciary. But today we talk about the protection of life, of property, and as I keep on saying, the protection of rights. You have to protect the Constitution. That is why you are an officer of the law. It's not enough to be law enforcing. You have to be law upholding. So you have to obey the law in the way that you process your policing. You can see that in the handling of the present situation where there is panic, where there are people going home, where there is breaking down of, not breaking down of law and order. There certainly hasn't been that. But millions of people are on the move. There is huge disruption. Now, you can either treat it as assisting to sort out and prevent the more dire consequences of a public health crisis, or you can treat it as a law and order situation. And unfortunately, you can't go ask the police who have been trained in a certain way for all these years and allowed to carry on that way and say overnight you're going to be of great assistance, but not treat this like a law and order problem. But what we don't know is how do we get to those solutions given the vested interests that are so deeply embedded in the police.
Right. And it also seems to me that, of all the various kinds of parts of the government, the police is perhaps the most politicized. And I'm talking here particularly at the level of states, right? I mean, there are some states where it's almost the norm that when you have a new government and a new chief minister in place, pretty much the entire top brass of the state's police undergoes a total, it's a total change. It's almost as if there are some people who are identified with certain parties and so on, right? And that level of politicization is something that you don't find with many other things. And do you think that could be another contribution to, in a sense, that blocks this kind of transformation that, you're talking about here?
Absolutely. And some of what you are saying, what we used to talk in hushed tones about the influence of the political executive, the influence of the legislator, the elected legislator on the police, has now actually crept its way into legislation where postings, transfers, career advancement is in the hands of the chief minister, the home minister, or a committee thereof. Now, the Supreme Court in 2006, in one of the public interest litigations that was brought actually by a former policeman, had dealt with this and said that you must create a state security commission, which was a bipartisan organization, which would lay down the general policy for the police, provision it, and then watch its performance. That is the way that it is done in many different countries. Then it created a police establishment board, which would deal internally, which was an internal mechanism for the merit system to come in transparently. But all that has been subverted, I would say, completely. Equally by the force of the political executive and the legislature on the establishment, but also because the leadership is not as deeply vested in the establishment as it is in perhaps listening to and being obedient to the political executive. These are not underprivileged people, Srinath. These are people with power of the law, uniform, good salaries, good equipment, and they're the top of the tree.
And do you think the kind of divide between the Indian police service, which is the All India service, and policing, which is a state subject and every state has its own police force, do you think that kind of divide also exacerbates this dynamic that you're talking about?
Yes, I think I can say I believe it must do, but the degree to which it must do, I'm not sure about because I haven't studied it in depth and I don't have the evidence to speak that way. But I think, yes, when you have two cadres one of which will not rise except through quite difficult means, but who knows the ground situation perhaps because it comes from there. So I'm sure that creates kinds of tension. But there is also, I believe, now deep concern within the police itself, from what I hear, between the other ranks, so-called other ranks, and the leaderships. Because one is almost a managerial cadre, and the other one is a sort of implementing cadre. And they have tremendous power, the implementing cadre. They have tremendous knowledge of the local. They know how to work the system, how to get the best out of the system, as well as to game the system. So to what extent, are their loyalties absolutely in one direction, like an arrow from the lower ranks to the upper ranks? Or are the loyalties divided between the local power structures, the state power structures? All of that has to come into the equation when you're understanding police performance.
No, I think that's very perceptive. And, it also seems to me that, if you compare the police with another institution that you know very well, which is the army, right? I mean, see, the army has a certain distinctive, institutional culture and identity of its own because it is separated from the society, right? I mean, you keep the army deliberately separate from the society. You created these cantonments, you created these kinds of structures within which it operates. Whereas the police has to be embedded in the society that it serves. So, in a sense, these challenges are going to be that much more difficult to mold and to control, isn't it?
Yes, and I think one of my regrets is that the police have been modeled on a militaristic style. The army has a very limited function, and that is to be on the borders and protect us from outside aggression. We cannot think of our public as being the subjects of watchfulness in case they get aggressive. I think that's an extremely unfair, wrong, unconstitutional view of how you must look at your society. This issue of separation of the police in lines, in privilege, in where they are deployed and situated, where they owe their loyalties, I think is extremely wrong. The police must owe their loyalty to the law and nothing else. Now, this is not a pipe dream. This is how real policing works. And the second thing is it must be embedded in society. In other jurisdictions, police are required to live within the jurisdictions that they work in or not outside so many miles of jurisdiction, because then they are vested in the society that they live in. And society can keep them accountable locally. It is the local accountability which is missing.
Let's talk a little bit about, bread and butter issues, so to speak. In your opening remarks, you talked about the kind of financial constraints that the police faces in aggregate terms. And that seems to be one of the major impediments to this kind of transformation, modernization of the policing system itself. Could we talk a little bit about that particular part of your findings in the report?
The police would say to you that they are poorly staffed, poor infrastructure, poor modern equipment. And I have not done sufficiently a study to tell you what is enough. The issue is, what are you doing with what you have? How well is it deployed? Who gets the lion's share? Is the lion's share given to headquarters? Is it given to equipment and comforts, etc.? I'm not particularly emphasizing comforts, but facilities to the higher cadres, because it is a pyramidal structure, right? In my view, the thing to look at, if you are looking at the economics and the finances of policing, is how much money is given to the police station and how much money is given to outreach and given to fulfilling the basic needs of an area. You will hear bitterly police complaining at the grassroots that they have the most stringent rules about how they use transport, where petrol and transport and jurisdiction don't match each other. All of these anomalies have to be looked at, and I'm hoping that the statistics that are there will help in doing this. Unfortunately, a lot of the statistics are gathered at state level, a lot at central level to the BPR&D, and a lot are kept in the local. Now, if some of those statistics could be mashed together so that you had a profile of every single station, what its needs and requirements were, and how a budget is made. Budgets are made in quite a centralized way. Again, I wish I knew more to tell you about how much voice there is of the constabulary that goes into the making of the budget and goes into decision making about equipment, time off, days off, the needs of the public, all of that. There is a great deal of data. You will find a lot of data on crime, how much work there is in a police station, etc. But it needs to be much more granular. That when we talk about modernizing the police and providing them with better infrastructure and better facilities, I do not mean providing them with state-of-the-art weaponry or equipment. In the absence of accountability and in the absence of the reorientation that I was talking about, that would be hugely dangerous for society. And the other lot of people who are never taken into consideration is the public. What does the public around a police station want of its police station? That is something that many jurisdictions take account of.
So your report, also covers pretty much all the states, and in that sense is extremely comprehensive. And I was wondering, when we are talking about policing, the report does a state-wise ranking, but do you think there are, some states which are doing well for reasons that perhaps other states would emulate? In a sense, is it more structural, or is it boils down to more questions of leadership within states? Or is it patterns of recruitment? I'm just wondering, do you think there are anything that, we can sort of pick out from what has made the better states the better ones, and use that as a template with local variations to other states which are lagging behind in these matrices and these in the index that you've sort of drawn up?
Yeah. The truth is that statistics only tell half a story, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes they get the story wrong also. And I would be the first to admit that. But that doesn't mean that the statistics have no use. In overall rank, you find Maharashtra coming first, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Punjab, Haryana. These are the first 5 states overall.
Yeah.
And then the lower, at the bottom of the pyramid, Uttar Pradesh is right at the bottom. Then Bihar coming up a little bit, Jharkhand coming up a bit more, Uttarakhand, Rajasthan, Andhra Pradesh, going like that. When you look at police itself, you see that Tamil Nadu is number 1. Because if you take all of the matrices that we looked at, finance, workload, diversity, trends, budgets, all of that, when we looked at that, Tamil Nadu averaged on many, but it came out first. Kerala, on the other hand, which is honestly got a very, very good police in the sense that it has changed its police act. It has consulted with the public in order to get to that act. It has got many outreach programs, etc. Unfortunately, came 13th in rank because its diversity in relationship to women particularly, has actually gone lower in the year that we took as the benchmark year, which was 2017, than earlier years, previous years. And then the environment, the same kind of policing or the benefits of the environment that Kerala has would perhaps not be available, say, in Uttar Pradesh. But because policing is a state subject, the states must make it specific to that state. Now, both Madhya Pradesh and Uttar Pradesh have got quite amazing facilities for dealing with crimes against women. And they are certainly worth emulating. So you find pockets of good practice, and also individuals of good inclination that do a great deal in terms of changing curriculums, improving training, but they seem not to get embedded and then reflected in the performance of the police.
So you spoke a bit about, what the role of the police in the current COVID crisis is and how they should be thinking about their role and so on. But, as we kind of look forward to the times of, in the post kind of COVID world, so to speak, I mean, do you think the crisis also gives us an opportunity to, take another very fundamental look at what we want by way of policing in this country? Because there has been a lot of talk and report about police reforms. There have been a number of CAG reports which talk about, all kinds of problems that the police force faces. Your statistics have captured so many, but still reform has been very hard in this particular domain. So I'm just wondering, if you could reflect a little bit on what those really structural impediments have been. And secondly, whether this particular crisis may actually be a moment which could catalyze a wider conversation around the need for this kind of more responsible democratic policing, which, as you so nicely put it, believes that its first and only role is to uphold the law.
It must believe that. And do they believe that? And is that reflected in their behavior, in their performance? That has to be seen. Unfortunately, we do look at police very much through a lens of their wrongdoing. And I think that is unfair. I think one should look at the police. There's no doubt in my mind that they must be held accountable and held strongly accountable for every single wrongdoing that they do. There is no compromise on that. On the other hand, what we don't look at is the performance of the police. There's no great matrix that is being formulated, which was hoped for in the state security commissions, which is transparent, that we will have 17 different lenses through which we measure the performance of the police. And then because we have got these lenses there, we will give the chief of police a mandate and we will tell him that here is what do you need. We will provision him. And when we have provisioned him, he will report back to us and that report will be taken to the legislature. It will be discussed there and we will see whether last year he did well, this year he's doing better, and his job will depend on it. That would be the clean way of doing everything. And that would be all the way down. The police chief would probably tell his cohort and probably tell his DCPs and all of those people, that this is how we are going to perform. And there must be in that performance an evaluation by public satisfaction. How satisfied are you with the police? Today, if you go out and ask people how satisfied they are with the police, the answer may be varied in varied jurisdictions. But we need to bring all of that together to say, this is how satisfied people are. In many jurisdictions, you will find that people who have actually dealt with the police rather than going by gossip and perception find that the police are much more helpful, useful, and they trust the police much more than people who have a general perception but have never met them. I think a benchmark indicator of how the police are performing will come from when you speak to women, And when you speak to children, when you speak to vulnerable areas of society, and you ask them how they perceive the police, not how they have been handled by the police, but how do they perceive the police?
Yes.
You can always keep crime down simply by never having anybody go to the police station. And our crime statistics are a crying shame. We must have honest statistics. And to get back a little bit to the question that you asked about reform, Srinath, we know what the problem is. We've known what the problem is from the Frazier report of 1902, 1903.
Right.
We have mashed that problem and brought it in the most detailed forms in the committees that start just after the emergency. The National Police Commission reports. Then
Yes.
there are state reports. Then there are the CAG reports. Then there are the civil society reports. So it's not that we don't know the problem. And the police themselves will be happy to talk to you about their problems. But we also know the solutions because the solutions have been given time and time again. But they are almost never acted upon, or if, like the 2006 solutions that were provided by in the Prakash Singh case by the Supreme Court, they are subverted or they are not at all complied with. And even when they are complied with, you can't just stop at 6 directions that were given by the Supreme Court. You have to actually work at year-on-year improvements of performance and also satisfaction within the police themselves about the job that they are doing factored in. You always hear policemen complaining about the hours that they have to keep. Now, one of the things that the Telangana police has done, for instance, is they pay their police much better. They also give them regular offs. They also give them shifts which have been worked into policing. There are studies by people like Mr. Kamal Kumar, who are experts in this field, to say that if you have 12-hour shifts, if you have 8-hour shifts, if you rationalize the way that you use your materials, your transport, etc., you will get far better policing from the police that you already have. Training is essential. And training is not standardized. Training is ad hoc. And it is an open secret that nobody wants to go to training institutions. Why do policemen alone have to train policemen? You have psychologists, medical people, all sorts of other kinds of professionals who would widen every constable's view. And I have another little hobby horse, which is that when you recruit people, you are recruiting with them all the societal prejudices and biases that person comes from, whether it's in his village or his economic status or his gender. He brings them all into the police. You have to bring in people who you can reorient to obey nothing but the law. This is not being done. This is not even understood sufficiently for it to be done. There is not the underlying research you need to decide what should be there.
Maja, thanks so much for joining us today. This report is extremely important. It is really eye-opening, eye-popping, in fact. We will link the report to the show notes, and we hope both the reports and these very reasoned arguments that you sort of presented today get a much wider hearing, and we really have the kind of broader conversation around what kind of a police does Indian democracy really need, and how do we get to that kind of a force. Maja Daruwala, thanks so much for being with us today.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Interpreting India. Stay safe and don't forget to wash your hands. For more information about the podcast and the production team, you can follow us on social media and visit our webpage.